Let's talk about your files. Again, I think your files, you can handle them the way you want to handle them, but in today's world, you can have everything digitally. You can have everything in Evernote or something like that. Your tenant files, what should be in there? The rental application, the verification information, credit reports, criminal reports, copies of IDs, deposit agreements and or receipts, the lease itself, photos of the unit or a video of the unit, the follow-up contact, and get new phone number of the tenant. Get new phone number of the tenant. Now, why do I say that? Well, this is kind of going by the wayside because I know more and more people that they don't have home phones anymore. It's all by their cell. And so, they used to move in and they get a new phone number. They don't do that anymore, pretty much. So make sure that you at least have their contact information and who they need to follow up with. In lieu of the phone number, I really heavily rely on email. And most people respond to email. They've got an email address, and it's very easy communication. The other reason that I like email is it's very hard to record a phone conversation. Matter of fact, it's against the law if you don't have their permission. It would be not admissible in court. So what do? You keep a journal of a phone log and write down what you talked about. You don't have to do that with email. You have an electronic version that was sent. You can see when you sent it, and if they respond back, you've got a copy of all of that communication. So I think it's a nice way to communicate. So email is a great way to go with that. Now, let's talk about rent. The tenant is now in. So we've gone through the fact that we've closed on the property. We talked about taking over a property with no leases. We've talked about taking over a property with leases. We've talked about filling vacancies. We've cleaned the unit. We've done maintenance on the unit. We've selected our tenant. We have got the prorated rent. We've gone through all of that. Now, the tenant has been there for a while. We want to talk about that idea of dealing with late rent. I get this question all the time. It's something that you should definitely talk with your property management firm on. And I believe this should be a system. Let's go back to our example. That late is due on the 1st, but late after the 5th. Due on the 1st, late after the 5th. I want you to develop this 2-5-3 system, and this is what that is. On the 7th, if you don't have the rent, you're either going to be, or somebody's going to be, maybe your property manager, calling, sending an email, and knocking on the door. Calling, sending an email, knocking on the door. That's the 7th of the month. If you don't have the rent 5 days later, and by the way, when you're knocking on the door, you're leaving a notice. When you're leaving a message on the phone, hey, your rent's not here, just want to give you a reminder, blah, blah, blah. 5 days later, so on the 12th, you're going to send them a pay or vacate letter. Now, it depends what state and municipality you're in. In the city of Chicago, it's 3 days. In the city of Chicago, if there's no lease in place, it's 30 days. It's 30 days. So again, you got to check on that. So I'm sending a letter that says on the 12th, you've got 3 days to pay or vacate, or we file eviction. Now, in certain states, by law, you've got to send that 3 days pay or vacate letter. By law, you've got to send that as official notice, so to speak. On the 15th, 3 days later, if they haven't paid, you're filing for eviction. You're filing for eviction. You're going to do that at the county government. At the county government. Okay, now, you might be able to do that at a city government within that county. They will maybe give you the opportunity to file for eviction there. You'll just have to check what's appropriate in that market. Basically, what you do is you file. Would you guys like to see? Do we have one? Do we have that one for that guy? A copy of the eviction thing we filed? You don't think so? Okay. Well, basically what it is, we just filed one last week. Basically what it is, it's a one page, and you're writing down the tenant's information, you're writing down their work information, where they moved to, if you know that, their phone number, your information, you've got your lease with that, you've got the application there, and any other supporting documentation. You don't need that supporting documentation yet, but it's always good to bring along with you when you're filling out the paperwork to go back and use for as a reference. Now you should have, okay, so if you want to see one, Heather can show you a copy one on her computer at the break or when we're done. It's always a good idea, you don't need to have it exact, but it's always a good idea that day that somebody that's filling out an eviction is going to have a monetary figure in mind. So in this case, we filed against this guy because it was a property that we took over from somebody else that we took over the management and ownership of. And they just let this tenant slide. Wasn't paying rent, and we're the new sheriff in town, and we tried to work a deal with him. He didn't work out, so that's not going to last too long with her. So we filed eviction on him for, I think it was $4,500 is everything that he owed. Now, we included everything, every single late fee, everything, and it turned out to be about $4,500. Typically, in eviction court, what they're going to do is say, this is your hearing, eviction hearing. You're going to show up to that hearing, and if the tenant's there but not paying rent, all the judge is going to deal with is the eviction of that tenant. Now, the judge is going to decide whether that tenant stays or goes. 90% of the time, the tenant doesn't show up, and they get an eviction judgment against that tenant. Other times, if the tenant shows up, they have a chance to state their case, just like a regular court case. Last year, I'm in the city of Chicago. Heather's with me. We file eviction. Heather and I were planning on spending the rest of the day downtown goofing around, but we had to go to eviction court first. Downtown Chicago, we were there at 9 o'clock, and the tenant showed up, okay? And which is a rarity, and I'm thinking, oh great, here goes our day, the tenant showed up. And the tenant, judges are very, from my experience, at least from courts in the Midwest, not all states are like this, but judges are very common sense orientated. It's black and white, is the evidence. They want to go by evidence. As an owner, as a property manager, I know the more evidence I can bring against that tenant, the better. Well, when the tenant just shows up and thinks that they have no evidence other than the squawking they do, that does not fly in a court of law. And when we're done, you can maybe ask Heather about that experience. But you've got to have evidence. If you have evidence there, you're not going to have problems for the most part. Depending on the state, California's tough, New Jersey's tough, things like that. But for the most part, if you're common sense and you have evidence, you're going to get a judgment for eviction against that tenant. Now, notice I didn't say anything about money. Money is typically not talked about at that first hearing. Normally, unless a state that you're operating in operates differently, you're going to have what is called a damages hearing. And it's usually about 2 weeks after your eviction hearing. The reason that most courts do that is because when the tenant is out of there, then and only then can you truly go in and assess the damages to the unit. That's why the damages hearing is usually after the eviction hearing. So at that damages hearing, if the tenant didn't show up to the eviction hearing, chances are they're not going to show up to the damages hearing. You win the damages hearing for $4,500. That's a judgment against that person individually, and it stays on their record until they settle with you or clear it up or file bankruptcy. That would eliminate that. That's the only way to eliminate that. Now, if you want to be aggressive with that, you could go back into the courts. I think you got to give it 6 months' time and go in to file a lien or garnishment of wages. So if the person has a steady job, you could file a lien or garnishment of wages, and they'll actually start to take the money out of their check, which they don't like, which at that point is when they typically go and file BK. Once they file BK, that's wiped off. You lose. You don't have a chance to collect that. The guy gets to start over, okay? But he can't do that again for another 7 years. He can't file BK for another 7 years. So that's kind of how it works from 30,000 feet up, okay? I would recommend that if you get some time, and let's just say that you're investing in St. Louis, Missouri. I would recommend going to St. Louis, Missouri, scouting out your market, looking at different opportunities, spending time with agents, property managers. Please set aside some time to go to eviction court there. It's very entertaining and educational. It's edutainment, if you will, okay? Yes?
John, on a number of occasions you've mentioned where you're buying a property, you negotiate, where there's something that you're taking in the process that's not great, you always get a trade-off.
Yeah.
So in the case like you just described, and what we went through now is they evicted some people before we closed, so that we closed with the problem people gone. Would you not normally, if you were buying a property, it was a 12 unit, that if one of them was late paying all the time, wouldn't you want them evicted before you took?
Yes, if they evict them but don't get a damages judgment against them, because you're getting all of those leases, you now have the equitable interest in those leases. If they haven't paid that money, you can actually go to the courts and get a damages hearing against that. Now, would the previous owner say, well, hey, I'm due some of that money? Maybe, maybe. But if you're going to spend the time going to court and getting a damages hearing and all that, then you probably should retain most of the financial rewards, if there are financial rewards with that.
But normally, wouldn't you want them out, though, before you took it?
Most likely. I think that there's circumstances, though, that I've taken over properties that someone has refused to pay rent because of a safety issue, meaning the landlord was not keeping the property safe. The maintenance requests would go unanswered, the toilets wouldn't work, the lights wouldn't work, and there's a certain degree of, tenants have rights too. There's no doubt about it. And you're signing a contract. When you sign a lease, the tenant has responsibility and the owner, property manager, has responsibility. Now, if the tenant was sharp and came with evidence as to why they weren't paying the rent, then that would be one thing. And there have been cases where they haven't paid the rent because of certain reasons. Their heat didn't work, or, that type of thing. Or they've actually gone and made the repairs themselves and spent the money on the repairs rather than paying the rent, kind of thing. So there's circumstances you want to check into. All right? Great questions. Yes?
If you've hired a property management company and they end up having to go on your behalf, I'm assuming as an absentee owner, to do legal process.
Yes.
Do you have compensation outlined in the agreement between the two of you? Or
let me kind of give you the compensation for eviction, or the cost for eviction. In the city of Chicago, it's about $160. Now, part of that money is for the filing of eviction. Part of that money is to pay the sheriff to go out and serve the eviction. It's got to be served, properly served. Elsewhere, it runs pretty similar to those costs. Say $160 and less, okay? In central Indiana, it's about $60. So somewhere between $60 and $160 is a good range that you should follow. Ask your property manager what they charge for eviction. There will be an extra charge, plus court cost. So if you've got $150 in court costs, and you've got your property manager going to court and doing this, they usually do it for a flat fee. It's anywhere from $150 to $300, depending on the market, depending on the system in that state, because sometimes they're required to go there 2 or 3 times. So that would be a good question to ask. Eviction isn't always inexpensive. Sometimes in lieu of eviction, you want to offer a program that they do on home ownership. It's called cash for keys. So we'll pay you to move out. You're gonna have a negotiated eviction, so to speak, and make sure they sign on the dotted line. If you move out, I'll put it in writing that I'll give you, $150 to move out. It would cost you less time, by the way, than going through the eviction process. So you may want to keep that in mind. It's a strange business, I know. Paying someone to move out. I've had people even pay movers to have people move out. They were so bad. But again, I think it comes down to that thing that we learn in business called that cost versus benefit analysis kind of thing. Anyway.